Welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Dr. Rohini Sudhakar from Department of Continuing in Adult Education and Extension Work of SNDT Women's University, Mumbai. Today, we are going to discuss about women-centered models, critique of models and reformulation of models. This module is written by Ranjini K. Murthy, who is a researcher and consultant on gender and development. The objectives of this module are that at the end of the module, the learners will be able to get familiar with women-centered models of development, know usefulness of models of community development and their convergence, divergence with women-centered models of development, and critique the existing women-centered models of development. Comprehend which models of development are appropriate and why. So, we will discuss models of development and women-centered models in detail. We will first see what do you mean by models. Models are a simplification of reality that can be compared to road maps, like how the road maps are there, models are there. Models reflect only certain aspect of reality and change and not others. No one map can include all aspects of reality, and similarly all models, no matter how complex, are constrained by basic assumptions, structure and uncertainties. Development models show pathways of securing social, economic and political progress through planned efforts aimed at the control of poverty, hunger, disease, illiteracy, economic underdevelopment, violence and lack of democracy. Traditional models of development have included modernization theory, growth with equality, dependency theory and world systems theory. Modernization model assumes that with assistance, traditional countries can be developed in the same manner that developed countries have been. Modernization theory was a dominant paradigm in the social sciences in the 1950s and 1960s and then went into a deep eclipse. It made a comeback after 1990 but remains a controversial model. Redistribution with growth model observed that economic growth and modernization approach had bypassed the poor and hence redistributive measures like land reforms were necessary for benefits to reach the poorest. Basic needs model emerged in the response to resistance faced from power holders to redistribution and advocated for directly enhancing income and access to basic needs of the poor. Human rights model argued for economic and social, cultural and civil and political rights of individuals and responsibility of state in the meeting these. The extent to which these development models address women's advancement and emancipation varied. The modernization and redistribution with growth model did not refer to women's issues, for example, land rights, which the basic needs were of women. And human rights model did discuss access of women to basic needs and rights of women as well. It is in this context that women-centered models of development emerge, of which 4 main ones are discussed in the next section. That is welfare, women in development, women and development and gender and development. Now, we will see women-centered models which created space for women of color, oppressed, caste, low incomes and working class to alter their living conditions and position vis-a-vis men, as well as through policy and legal measures from above. Women-centered models do not entail women subordinating men or others. Women-centered models of development. We will see that women-centered models to development include the welfare, women in development, women and development, and gender and development models. Each model originated at a different time but is still reflected in policies now. Welfare model, we will see, with the establishment of United Nations during post World War II period, what was called decades of development compensated. During the first decade of development, that is 1960 to 70, it was assumed that economic growth resulting out of modernization would trickle down to the poor and lead to economic and social benefits to all households. Within the household, it was assumed that women and men would benefit equally from economic growth. The poor in developing countries were seen as those who failed to benefit out of markets requiring welfare measures. Within this model, women were seen primarily as mothers and wives with no role to play in contributing to economic growth. The critics of this model said that renowned feminist economist Myra Buchanan notes that poor women in the third world had become the main beneficiaries of welfare programs begun by national and international relief agencies soon after the end of World War II. These welfare programs were designed to relieve poor women's needs exclusively in terms of their roles as mothers and wives. According to Moser, the welfare model ignored the productive role of women and the community management role. For example, participating in communities meetings for the benefit of all, like in water use associations of women, and emphasis was mainly on addressing needs like family planning programs and maternal and child health. The model was not very threatening and continues in various forms even today. Now we will see next model, women in development. Women in development model during the second development decade, that was 1970 to 80, it was there. The discourse on development shifted to various themes like redistribution with growth by international labor organization, attack on basic needs, and assault on world poverty. The importance of integration of women into development was emphasized from both intrinsic lens, that is benefiting women directly, as well as instrumental lens. Women were seen as important players in development, and the focus was on integrating them productively into development. This model, known as Women in Development model, continued with the pressure from American women's movement to declare 1975 as the International Women's Year and to declare 1975 to 85 as the first International Women's Decade. Equality, development and peace were the three themes for the International Women's Decade. While women from developed first world countries emphasized equality, women from developing third world countries were concerned with women's economic development. Women from conflict-ridden second world were concerned with peace. The equality and anti-poverty strands of women in development emerged during 1970s and 1980s, while the efficiency strand developed during late 1980s and early 1990s when structural adjustment packages were initiated by World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. Each of these strands of women in development model is elaborated here. Equality. The equality strand emphasizes that women could not emerge as equal to men as equal opportunities were not provided to them. This strand was popular during 1975 to 1985. Further, equality strand was found to be threatening by the men in power. The concern was with meeting strategic gender interests of women in a top-down manner, and women were not organized effectively to meet these needs, and neither was there any emphasis on working with men to change negative gender attitudes. An example of the equality strand in India is the first comprehensive study on status of women leading to the report Towards Equality in 1974. Equality researchers argued that development was not reaching the poor and that poverty in developing countries was indeed feminized. The existence of many women-headed households was heightened. Anti-poverty. It is in this context that the anti-poverty strand of women in development model evolved in the late 1970s and early 1980s. The primary reason for poverty was not seen as the direction of mainstream capitalist development or the skewed distribution of resources, but the fact that the poor did not have access to credit, skills, extension and employment, which would increase their income and productivity. The main reason for feminization of poverty was seen as exclusion of women from income generation activities and not really capitalist patriarchy, which denied women right to means of production, for example land, on their names, to have the land on women's name. The anti-poverty strand perceived poor women as a distinct category, but tended to recognize only the practical gender needs related to their productive roles. In India, the microcredit based self-employment program, integrated rural development program introduced in 1978 targeting individuals, reflects the anti-poverty strand. The anti-poverty program continues to be popular even now amongst government of India, which is reflected in Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme. Efficiency. The seeds of efficiency strand were sown in the 1980s in Copenhagen, where the United Nations Mid-Decade Conference on Women was held. The conference was dominated by debates on trade, development and politics. By late 1980s, it was clear that the burden of structural adjustment was borne by women. For example, with serious cuts in health care spending by government, the focus on efficient development meant that the existing burden of care shifted even more towards women than before. Further, in the economic sphere, women's resilience and ability to adjust to crisis was recognized. Women in the formal sector were prepared to work longer and for lesser pay than men. All these qualities attracted private sector and development planners to focus economic intervention on women. Another stream of efficiency is the shift in microcredit programs from individual focused self-employment credit with low rates of interest to group-based microcredit schemes targeted at women with higher rates of interest. Women were seen as better in repayment of loans. Equality, women were mobilized into water and sanitation committees as they were seen as better managers of these common resources. On the whole, the efficiency strand was premised on this assumption that development would be more efficient and effective if there is investment in women. In mid 1990s and 2000s, in fact, poor women were seen as sites of investment by non-banking finance companies and formed into joint liability groups with little investment in capacity building, gender training or social capital formation. The interest rate being high and their asset and skill base not being strengthened, the women found it difficult to repay the loan, leading in worst case scenario to a few women members committing suicide like in parts of Andhra Pradesh and Tamil Nadu. Now the government has started regulating microfinance sector. Another example in India of the efficiency strand of women in development model is the cutting out of the male health inspector cadre and placing a burden of health care on women health staff like female auxiliary nurse midwives and accredited social health activists, that is ASHA. Now critic of this women in development model, we will see what is the critic. The critics are from several quarters. It has been argued that women in development model saw humans including women as atomized individuals isolated from social structures. The women in development model operated on the premise of gender roles rather than gendered power relations. It assumed that irrational prejudices of sex roles, stereotypes of policymakers and planners were the main problem which could be overcome with education. Further, women were seen as having homogeneous needs and the diversity of practical gender needs and strategic gender interest amongst women based on race, caste, class, etc. were not recognized. For example, while a thresher may be useful for women whose households having agricultural land, it may displace labor of women whose households do not have land. Further, the women in development stands, while challenging the stereotyping of women as passive players in production, assumed that they were biology less and without sex specific needs. As observed by Kabir, what is required is the unraveling of male power relations, analysis of conflicting gender interests amongst women based on their location in other power relations, shift in discourse from learnt roles to power relations, and prioritization of not just planning solutions but also political solutions. The best critique of women in development model can be summed thus that women in development model approaches are like treating cancer with band-aid. Women and development, we will see this model, women and development. The proponents of the women and development model to women's development hold the view that the problem was not that women were not integrated into development as assumed by those who held women in development position, but that they were integrated in an unequal way due to global capitalism which exploited women's cheaper productive labor than men for profits, in particular to those in developing countries. Unlike the proponents of the women in development model, the proponents of the women and development model perceived that society was not in equilibrium but in conflict. Class differentiated rewards are used by capitalists to keep the working class fragmented and in conflict. Unlike the women in development model, the women and development model emphasized that the main reason for women's secondary status they played primacy on the structure of capitalist patriarchy. The main proponents of women and development model were from the developed nations. They were slowly realizing that the concerns of third world women, that profits were being made by the capitalists in developed countries using the subsidized productive work of women, were also legitimate. The earlier patronizing attitude towards third world women diminished soon, and efforts were made to link issues of the family with that of politics at the local, national and international levels. The gathering at the Nairobi Third World Conference on Women held in 1985 represents attempts by women from the first world and third world to forge an alliance. In this meeting, the need for challenging laissez-faire model and patriarchy as a system was highlighted. A working class struggle in which women's issues were integrated was seen as the answer. A critic of this women and development model will see that the women and development model has been critiqued from several points of view. The women and development model emphasizes the exploitation of women for accumulation of profit on a global scale, but overlooked women's important role in satisfaction of needs, in particular in the arena of the care of sick, elderly and reproduction of cheap labor for market. The biology-less assumption that underpins women in development has persisted in the women in development model to women's development. Further, though there was a reference to capitalist patriarchy, there was a tendency to read gender relations and class relations in isolation and not look at how they interlock in different contexts differently. In fact, the term gender relation was not used, but instead the term women was used. While gender relations are diverse and capitalism derives benefit from gender relations, the institutional sites of household and work places are organized differently, and in some contexts, capitalist patriarchy has been emancipatory, that is, bringing out women domestic workers into other occupations, and in some oppressive for women. Kabir also notes that women and development model does not explain how biological differences lead to social differences. That is, it does not explain which social institutions lead to construction of gender, race, class, caste and other social relations. The construction of a uniform global patriarchy and capitalism was problematic. She also notes that reverting to subsistence production as suggested by Mize may not be the way to move forward. Instead, it is important for women to negotiate with social institutions. These institutions were under contradictory pressure from capitalism, patriarchy, racism, casteism, etc., and create spaces which can be used for negotiating women's diverse interests. The quotation below from Geeta Sen and Karen Groen is the precursor to the gender and development model. The quotation goes like this: only by sharpening the links between equality, development and peace can we show that the basic rights of the poor and the transformation of the institutions that subordinate women are inextricably linked. They can be achieved together through the self-empowerment of women. Gender and development model. Now, we will see this gender and development model. The gender and development model emerged in the late 1980s and early 1990s when participatory and rights-based models to development became popular. In contrast to women in development and women and development, the gender and development model perceives that women do not have uniform interest. Women have multiple identities of caste, class, race, ethnicity, marital status, differential ability, etc. in addition to their gender identity. The gender and development model recognizes the relationship between women and men as a power relation and sees that such power stems from social construction of gender shaped by social institutions of household, community, market state and suprastate. The gender and development model does not see women as passive victims but agents who are negotiating spaces within their multiple identities and institutions. Like women and development, the gender and development model perceives that the dominant development model manipulates women in peripheral countries. Further, it recognizes that women's subordination exists even in developed countries. The gender and development model mainly advocates for women's empowerment. The discourse on women's empowerment brought to the forefront issues of oppressive gender relations, ecological destruction, and the ethics of multinational control over the developing countries and so on. At the Nairobi Third World Conference on Women in 1985, some Third World feminists formed a group called Development Alternatives with Women for a New Era, that's DAWN, which interpreted development issues from a Third World women's perspective. They pointed out that the concept of development followed in the post-colonial world has been guided by a Western patriarchal and capitalist idea of economic development, which believed that change was linear. They rejected the aggressiveness of the dominant system and advocated the values of nurtureness and openness, discarded hierarchy, and recognized the diversity of feminism in third world countries. Further, the empowerment strand recognized not only power relations of gender but also relations of caste, class, race, etc. as having a bearing on women's subordinate position. The empowerment strand, according to Moser, sought to address strategic gender interests and practical gender needs, though building new political, economic and social models. In India, the empowerment strand of gender and development model is best reflected in the Mahila Samakhya program titled Education for Women's Equality, under which mainly poor women are organized into groups with an open agenda of discussing what issue is important for their village. Their capacity is built to challenge all hierarchies including caste, class, race and gender. Further, the women's group at times take on the challenges of resource grab by multinational corporations and domination by corporates. Critics of this model will see, in practice, the term empowerment has been co-opted in many different ways by neoliberal policymakers. The term women's empowerment is used by non-banking finance companies to refer to formation of joint liability women's groups and strengthening financial literacy and access. Some donors like World Bank see investing in gender equality as smart economics that leads to economic growth. That is, gender analysis of what women and men do and gendered constraints is used to promote business and efficient growth, akin to the efficiency approach. This dilutes the power dimension within the concept of gender and social relations. Government of India, 2015, India's report on the implementation of Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action shows that action did take place. The preconception and prenatal diagnostic techniques, that's Prohibition of Sex Selection Act 1994 was formed. Women successfully protesting against high interest rates with private capital before government regulated the same. Maternity benefit schemes like Janani Suraksha Yojana was started in 2011. National Rural Livelihood Mission was started in 2011, and special focus was on forming self-help groups and federations and strengthening livelihoods, women farmers, single women, Dalits, Adivasis and women with disability, etc. Women's informal justice systems, which take up issues of property rights, violence on women, etc. were started. Garment industry training, women in tailoring for growth of the industry were started. Now we will see models of community development and models of women-centered development. Models of community development. Rothman puts forward 3 models of community development, namely locality development, social planning and social action. According to him, the 3 models are not to be used separately. At times, one needs to combine 2-3 models at the same time. The 3 models are briefly explained here. First, we will see locality development model. This model is based on the belief that in order to foster change, a wide variety of community members should be involved in planning, implementation and evaluation. Key themes include the use of democratic procedures, voluntary cooperation, self-help, the development of the local leadership, etc. This is a bottom-up model but may not necessarily be pro-poor. The second model given by Rothman is social planning model. This model is a deliberately planned and technical process of problem solving with regard to substantive social problems like mental health, housing and sanitation. The degree of participation of different members of the community is limited. Building community capacity or fostering radical or fundamental social change is not a major goal of this model of community development. The third model is social action model. Practitioners practicing this model assume that a disadvantaged segment of the population needs to be organized in order to make demands on the larger community for increased resources or improved treatment. Key themes in this model are social justice, democracy and the redistribution of power, resources and decision making. This model is again bottom up like the locality model but with only the marginalized being organized. Now we will see relation between models of community development and models of women's development, which is complex. There is no one correct answer. The welfare model and anti-poverty and efficiency strands of women in development model may be compatible with locality development and social planning models of community development. Equality strand of women in development model may in tune with the social planning model of community development. Empowerment, gender and development model may be compatible with social action model of community development. Critique of models and reformulation of women's central model. Hierarchies of models not relevant. A central critique of women-centered model of development is that they place other models on a hierarchical scales with welfare being at the bottom and empowerment at the top. This placement may not reflect the needs of poor women. Poor young women, for example, need a combination of child care services, reservation of 1/3 of government managed markets for women, and informal and access to market, financial services, access to in-house training on operations of the mechanized tailoring machines so as to work in garment industry, and membership in producer companies, trade unions, federations and local governments to negotiate and bargain for their interest in different spheres. Equity strand as an alternative, according to Kabir, a combination of welfare model, all the strands of the women in development model and empowerment strand of gender and development model is crucial for achieving equity in outcomes for women. She refers to this approach as equity strand of the gender and development model. Equity strand highlights the need for challenging broader gender and social relations of institutions of society, household, community markets and state to move towards equity in outcomes. One could add supra-state institutions. Empowerment is necessary for equity but may not be enough. Strengthen sustainable development. Goal 5, targets and indicators. The Sustainable Development Goals evolved by United Nations in consultation with national government have translated the concept of women's empowerment into specific outcome targets and indicators focusing. However, the concept of women's empowerment entails unleashing of individual and collective processes to change hierarchical beliefs of women and men, changes social norms which privilege men, upper caste, majority communities, etc., and change institutions in favor of marginalized women. Further, the present Sustainable Development Goal 5 targets and indicators treat women as homogeneous, unlike the equity strand, which recognizes the diversity amongst women and the need to achieve equity between women at the bottom and men at the top. Need to challenge overall development program. Most women-centered models of development operate within a neoliberal model of development other than women and development model. Privatization, liberalization and globalization policies that underpin neoliberal economic models harm marginalized women. For example, privatization of education for the bottom rung in India has meant that girls have lesser access to education than boys, with parents being unable to support education of both children. Globalization has led to collapse of prices of some of the fruits like pears and apples, with fruits coming from outside. Vegetables and fruit cultivation and marketing is more in the hands of women when compared to grain cultivation. Opening up of the market weakens marginalized women unless they are organized and empowered to engage with these institutions. So now, while concluding in the summary part, we would like to say that this module sought to define the concept of development model and women-centered development models and different women-centered models of development that have evolved over time, and welfare women and development, gender and development, drawing upon Kabir. It argues that the equity stand of gender and development model, which drawn upon its precursors, has several strengths. It calls for bargaining with gender and social relations played out with institutions for promoting gender equity. The social action and social planning models of community development are necessary for furthering gender equity. Thank you.